Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of World History. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are looking at the Great Dying. That is the destruction of Native American societies in the New World following the arrival of the Spanish. So, our essential question is, why did so few Native Americans survive European colonization of the West? Well, there are four answers we're going to talk about, but number one is definitely number one, and that is disease. See, Native Americans had very little resistance to Afro-European diseases. And following the introduction of these diseases to the Western Hemisphere, about 90% of Native Americans died from exposure to these diseases. That is devastating, right? 90% of a population is a massive chunk to have died from disease as the primary cause. Now, there were a lot of diseases taking lives. The big ones are smallpox, that's kind of top of the list. Typhus and measles were also big ones. Now, it's not that simple, though, just to say that 90% of people died from this disease. We know from a previous lesson that when smallpox got into the Inca population, it killed off about 50%. There's a big gap between 50 and 90. Well, what else was going on plays a role here. Malnutrition is a horrible thing for our bodies, right? When we don't have enough good, healthy food, our bodies are less able to fight off illness. And this means that once these European diseases arrive, if we are strong and healthy to begin with, we've got a, decent shot of survival. But if we're already weak, our chances of survival drop significantly. And enslaved Native Americans rarely had a healthy, well-rounded diet. And to put on top of that, Native Americans who weren't enslaved or forced into a system of labor and bondage regularly were facing starvation because Europeans would attack and destroy native food supplies and intentionally drive them towards starvation, either to force natives out of a particular area or just in the course of warfare to weaken their opponents. So Europeans were taking other actions to weaken the Native Americans that made the problem of disease more severe. That being said, the big answer is still disease. European colonists and explorers didn't understand germ theory. They didn't know that this was happening because of their actions, or at least some may have suspected, but most did not know. This was not an intentional disease genocide. This was not germ warfare. So you can't really hold them accountable for that, but you can definitely hold them accountable for the horrific treatment of Native Americans that led to the increase in the death rate and the spread of these horrible diseases. All right. Background here on answer number two, which is slavery. Now, Christopher Columbus, the first governor of Spanish-held territories in the New World, was governor of Hispaniola and was an absolutely atrocious governor, basically in every way that you could consider this, but particularly because of how he treated the native people of Hispaniola, the Arawaks. The Arawaks were forced into a system where they had to pay gold to Columbus on a regular basis. And the punishment for not having found enough gold, of which Hispaniola does not have a lot of gold, was to have a hand cut off. You see here in this image the result of a lot of people who did not find enough gold. Now, at this time, having your hand cut off was pretty close to a death sentence for one of two reasons. Number one, the infection that would come from such a ghastly wound, right? Like, you're going to get sick following that. And if you're already malnourished because you're spending time trying to find gold instead of hunting, gathering, or farming, you're not going to have good chances of surviving that. If you do survive it, you now are without a hand to get more food and to successfully hunt, gather, or farm. You're going to be dependent on other people to help you get enough food to survive, but those other people are off trying to find gold so they don't get their hands cut off. Nobody can take care of you. and then you die a slower death of starvation while waiting to find some food. And this is why by 1538, 40 years after, a little over 40 years after Columbus arrived on the island, there were only 500 Arawak still alive on that island. This is out of a population of 250,000. So tremendous mismanagement. So answer number 2 does wind up being slavery here. Now, Columbus was extreme in his brutality and mismanagement. Not to say that the Spanish were ever particularly great at this, but Columbus was the worst example. And it does lead to his removal as governor. He actually returns to Spain in chains because of how badly he mismanaged his colony. Yay, Columbus Day. But enslavement of the Native Americans does continue in the New World for quite some time. Now, Native Americans did not make good slaves. There were several reasons why Native Americans didn't make great slaves, but the big, most important one is this high death rate from disease. Native Americans were more susceptible to disease to begin with, and once enslaved, they have close confines, hard labor, not a great diet, much more likely to die from disease. So Native Americans simply didn't make good slaves. So this will taper off and eventually mostly end in terms of outright slavery once African slaves are introduced to the continent. Answer number 3 is warfare. Many Americans did die as a direct result of warfare. They died in combat. The reasons for this are because of the European military advantages. Horses. Europeans could move much more quickly, and fighting from horseback, particularly against foes that don't have gunpowder, is a real advantage. Guns, particularly cannons, but also rifle, are an advantage that the Europeans had. And steel being more durable and sharper than most Native American weapons, and also in particular the armor that many of the Spaniards would wear. A stone-tipped arrow hitting steel armor is not going to cause a lot of damage. So this was an advantage that they had. These advantages really did lead to Europeans, Spanish, defeating the Native Americans in nearly every major military engagement that they encountered. Anytime armies went head-to-head, the Spanish would come out ahead. The fourth and final answer is the collapse of society in general. The other factors, disease, enslavement, and warfare, all resulted in the collapse of societies. Now, I want to take disease for just a moment and talk about this one. 90% of your population dies of disease, even if it was just 50. Somewhere in between. 75% of your population dies from disease. That means 75% of your government, 75% of your doctors, 75% of your farmers are all dying. Now, all of a sudden, you're lacking leadership, you're lacking medical care, you're lacking food in your society as a whole. That is going to lead to some serious problems. And the collapse of societies due to the lack of all these important people is going to increase the problem of disease, enslavement, and warfare. Your doctors are all dying, disease spreads more quickly. Disease spreads more quickly and your people are dying off. You can't defend yourself, so more will be enslaved. And when you do have to fight those battles, you've got fewer people to fight and win, and therefore you lose more battles. So disease, enslavement, and warfare became a bigger problem because of the collapse of society, and society collapsed even more as disease, enslavement, and warfare spread. Without this decision-making authority, Americans really could not coordinate effective responses to those threats. So number 4 is the collapse of society as a whole. All right, that was our great dying. I hope you learned something in today's lesson, and I will see you next time. Farewell.